So this is our third annual lecture in the history and philosophy of biology. Thanks everyone for coming and welcome. It's organized by the Inter-University Program in History and Philosophy of Biology, some of whose members are here in the audience. This program is sponsored by the Council for Higher Learning, Malag, and by Keren Madei Ruach, and we're very grateful to both of them for their support. I also want to especially thank our present venue, the Van Leer Institute, which has been a partner in this program from the get-go and has hosted previous lectures. So thanks to the current and former head of the Institute, Shai Levy and Gabi Motzkin. Thanks to Shulamit Laron, who has helped us extensively in organizing this and previous events. Thanks to Chagai Boaz and I guess everyone at the Van Leer. Okay, so we're delighted and honored to have as our guest Professor John Dupré, who's an internationally renowned philosopher of science and biology. Professor Dupré is a member of the Department of Sociology, Philosophy, and Anthropology at the University of Exeter, and head of the Center for the Study of the Life Sciences there. And he's also a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, a former president of the British Society for Philosophy of Science, and the president-elect, I guess, of the Philosophy of Science Association, soon to be the president. I'll just mention, just because this is a general audience, I'll just very briefly mention a few things about the work of Professor Dupré. I mean, some people who are more in the field may know it, probably do know it, others don't. In his extensive body of work, probably the best known kind of position he's advocated is a pluralist view about science in general, biology in particular, and that starting in the, I guess, mid-80s, and especially in his 1993 book, The Disorder of Things, Metaphysical Foundations of the Disunity of Science. He suggested that a kind of worldview that best suits present-day science is one on which there are multiple distinct, often incompatible ways of carving up and understanding the world. Then throughout the 2000s, he wrote a series of works on human nature and on the sort of place of humans in the animal and living world. And in very recent times, and we'll hear, at more recent times, we'll hear about that today, John Dupré has developed a new, and I think really exciting view of biology. Important themes from that view occur in his 2012 book, Processes of Life, which is a collection of essays, and it's been the focal topic of a large ERC-funded project at the University of Exeter, which culminated in a book that just came out called Everything Flows, a collection of essays and a kind of programmatic collection in some ways. So both of those are from Oxford University Press and are highly recommended. And that's it, I'm done. Thank you again for coming, and the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Arnon, for that very nice introduction. And may I add my thanks to all the people and institutions who've made it possible for me to be here. It's always a great privilege to visit this city and this exciting part of the world. So my thanks too. Okay, so let me start. The question that sort of underlies my project here is a very ancient one. I think it arguably, you can perhaps say it's the sort of founding question at the beginning of Western philosophy. And here, two of the famous pre-Socratic Greek philosophers, Parmenides and Heraclitus, and of course, being pre-Socratic philosophers, there's very little of their writings, but among the fragments, Parmenides is famous that exist. Parmenides is famous for saying change is an illusion, nothing really changes. And Heraclitus is famous for saying nothing stays the same, everything changes all the time. Now, I guess the Parmenidean position is obviously has to be interpreted a little. It's pretty obvious that some things change, but the way that it's come down to us is, and here's a third pre-Socratic philosopher, Democritus, as you can see, the laughing philosopher, and so nice picture of him laughing. And his version of the Parmenidean view is what's come down in later centuries as atomism. Nothing exists except atoms and empty space, atoms and the void. And everything else is opinion, which is just to say we don't really know anything about it. So the idea is that atoms move around and they maybe come together and form kind of more complex things that seem to change, but all that's really there are the atoms moving from one place to another. And this is obviously rather quick and simplified history, to put it mildly, but essentially I want to say that Parmenides won. And in particular, the point at which his victory kind of seemed to be established was with the scientific revolution. And this is one of the aspects of the science revolution was atomism became seen to be the kind of foundation for the scientific worldview. That actually science was quite largely about trying to understand how a world of atoms interacting with one another, bumping it, just basically pulling and pushing one another, could come to explain all the apparent complexity, the buzzing, blooming confusion, as it was once famously described, of the world. And this is a quote from one of the major figures of that scientific revolution, which is essentially saying that's all that's really there. The resources for the scientists trying to explain the world are the qualities of these small particles of matter and essentially they're just little hard, impenetrable, and eternal constituents of the world. And essentially they have a size, they have a shape, they move, they bump into one another, and so on. And though, of course, physics has become much more complicated than that nowadays, I think this is still a picture that guides a great deal of the way. Certainly philosophers in doing my own line of work, but beyond that, a lot of people who think about the world see that as the scientific worldview. Now, what I want to claim in this talk is that, in fact, Parmenides' victory was disastrous for the future of biology. And indeed, Heraclitus was much closer to the truth as a way of understanding biology and the living world in general. And indeed, life is all process, and I'll explain what that means. And this atomist picture is quite mistaken. Indeed, I think Parmenides was right. Really, nothing exists except change. Sorry? I'm sorry. I apologize. It was a long time ago. Okay, so here's an overview of what I was saying. I hope it's obvious by now that the title of my talk was a little bit of a trick. I'm not saying that nothing is alive. I'm saying that whatever is alive is not a thing. And of course, a thing is actually, and I have to apologize, I'll use the word, loosely, because you can't get through an English sentence without using the word thing or something or anything or everything. But thing, nevertheless, is my term for what the world is not composed of. And I'll explain what I take things to be and what I take processes to be, which is what I think the world, certainly the living world, is made up of. I say certainly the living world because that's what I will talk about tonight. I actually strongly feel that the rest of the physical world too is similar in this regard. So I'll say something about what the difference between a world of things and processes is, and then I'll explain why specifically organisms, which still, despite some excitement about genes, are still really the focal point of thinking about life, why they are in particular processes and very much not things. Then this, what I call a process ontology, I'll roughly try and summarize how this ties together in a bigger picture that includes more than just organisms. And I'll say a little bit, I haven't got on the summary, I'll say a little bit about specific relevance to humans. And then that's part, I guess, of the final thing of saying a little bit about why I think this matters. It isn't just a very abstract reflection on obscure philosophical questions. Okay, this is a kind of little aside that may be more a problem for my colleagues than perhaps for people coming from other directions. But one of I think the most common disquiet that this whole project causes in many of my colleagues interested in the philosophy of science is say, why do you care about metaphysics at all? I mean, isn't that just really abstract? And I mean, why do you care about this abstract kind of questions? Shouldn't you just focus on, real bits of biology, evolutionary theory or genetics or, real stuff, not just this broad abstract view of things. I guess the most I can say is that I hope to persuade some of you just by showing that these questions are of interest, and also that they have some implications for things that are more obviously important. And I guess I'll just give a little quote from a sort of one of the founders of my particular field, the philosophy of biology, which I like, physiologists. He's obviously particularly talking about people interested in this branch of biology, who suppose themselves to be above metaphysics, are only a very little bit above it, being up to the neck in it. So, things and processes. So, what do I mean by a thing? Now, this is, I claim, the concept that most philosophers think is the fundamental one for describing the world. The world is composed of things, little things like atoms, big things like planets, and in a phrase that's become very famous in philosophical circles, medium-sized dry goods. So I think actually J.L. Austin, who first said it, something like moderate-sized examples of dry goods. But at any rate, things like tables and chairs. And if you do read, kind of more technical philosophy, there are a lot of tables and chairs in it. They figure very largely. So what are these things like? They are, and there's a technical philosophical term, substances, which I'll try and avoid using, which really, I think, means more or less things, but of course has a great deal more philosophical baggage because it's a philosophical technical term. So a thing is a kind of thing always, defined by particular properties. It's autonomous. That's to say, it doesn't depend on anything else or its relations to anything else for its existence. You can imagine a world in which there is just that table and nothing else, and it would be perfectly happy, just being there all on its own. Or just one atom. There might be a world somewhere with just one atom in it, just carrying on happily to eternity. Things have at least fairly clear boundaries. And there's a problem, and I'm not going to go into this, there's an ancient and really difficult philosophical problem about how we talk about things changing at all. But the standard answer is there are some properties that things have that can change, and there are others that they can't and still exist because they cease to be that thing. At any rate, the default state of a thing is stasis. It stays the same because, and if something happens to it, that's the sort of thing that we need to explain. Now, processes, so I guess I just end. So these are, paradigm things. These are actually figure very largely in philosophical discussions, but I want to obviously query whether any of this fits these sorts of objects, entities, something. So what's a process? And this is obviously what I want to say is a much better way of thinking about at least the living world. None of what I said about things applies to processes. Things are often understood to be eddies in a flux of process. So if you think of the Heraclitus' most famous example is, of course, a river, because you may have no doubt heard his most famous quote, "You cannot step into the same river twice, because the river contains new water, and indeed you are different from the last time you tried to step into it." So a river is a kind of process. It's the process of water finding its way downhill towards the ocean. I guess people often think of kind of more dynamic things like battles. I actually showed on the last slide a picture of Jupiter. There's a very lovely process on the surface of Jupiter, the great red spot. And I like this particular example of a process because it's actually been pretty much what it is for at least as long as people have had telescopes capable of seeing it. It's a very stable process, but it's not stable because nothing happens. It's stable because winds of several hundred kilometers an hour are swirling around it, maintaining essentially that shape. So it's a pattern. It is precisely an eddy in the flux of flow of winds on the surface of the planet. The crucial point, all of these things require activity. They require change to continue to exist. And of course, if there's no water flowing down the river, there's no river. When everybody decides to go home or everyone's dead, the battle is over. And if the winds stop on Jupiter, the red spot will disperse and there will be no longer exist. And so, again, of course, I ask whether these kinds of living things belong in this category. Okay, so let me just summarize a little bit what I said. So this traditional concept of a thing, which I claim is the standard way in which philosophers have generally understood the world as containing, are integrated. I mean, they kind of hold together. They're independent. They don't depend on anything else for their existence. Unless something happens to them, they're stable, and they have definite boundaries. And I want to say none of these characteristics is necessary for a process. As I just said, processes persist through activity. The default consists, for processes, obviously the default is always activity. If there's no activity, they cease to exist. And a little quote from two of the more prominent philosophers, Nicholas Rescher and Johanna Seibt, who are enthusiasts for process thinking. As process ontologists see it, enduring things are never more than patterns of stability in a sea of process. So my kind of sort of rough definition of a process is anything, I say something, obviously, as I said, this was a problem. If I start saying some entity, this is going to sound like kind of jargonistic philosophy gone mad, but so I'll just say something for which change or activity is necessary for it to continue to be the kind of entity it is. And I have to say a word quickly about the most famous process philosopher perhaps there's been, since Heraclitus maybe, was Alfred North Whitehead. And nowadays his name has come to be more or less synonymous with process philosophy. Now, as a matter of fact, I think this is, though I have great respect for Whitehead, I think in some ways the reason that process philosophy is less popular in my field than it should be is because Alfred North Whitehead is very hard to read. In particular, he wrote a famous book, Process and Reality, which is the kind of, summary of his philosophical system. And unless you're an expert on Whitehead or a specialist, believe me, you don't want to read it. It's full of technical terms. It's actually rather horribly written, and it's just very obscure. And it also has themes in it that really I don't find helpful for my own philosophy. It's a very theological work in many ways. He has a panpsychist view of the world, of everything being slightly mental. And all of these things I find difficult. And indeed, to be a bit technical about it, I'm not even sure he's really a process philosopher. And I won't go into that. This is just a provocation for anyone in the room who is a Whitehead enthusiast. But in the end, he's a kind of atomist. He just has very strange atoms in his philosophy. So this is, I guess, for anyone who who saw this was a talk about process and was expecting me to talk about Whitehead, I must disappoint you. Okay, so the next part of the talk, I want to explain a little bit about the many reasons why organisms are so much better thought of as processes than as things. So I just list and then I'll say a little bit more about them. I think there are three reasons, each of which is quite conclusive, why we should think of organisms as processes. Now, one of the, and I think the first two at least, and perhaps the third, are all rather familiar, but just not always sufficiently reflected on. So the first thing is again, perfectly familiar. You know, the normal state of an organism is not stasis. We exist by eating and breathing and drinking, and if we stop doing those things, we very soon stop being. And of course, you know, these things we don't just shovel them in. They enable countless trillions of little activities to go on throughout our body, exquisitely orchestrated to maintain this eddy in the flux of process, the process of things flowing through us and being organized in the way characteristic of the particular form of life we are. Now that is, of course, it seems to me, is the extraordinary challenge of trying to do biology, is to try and understand how this works, this flow through this little stability that somehow maintains it over long periods of time. The second thing is, of course, organisms have life cycles. When we think of if you think of a cat, you probably think of, a grown-up cat that's maybe, sitting in front of a fire, purring or whatever. But of course, you also know there are kittens, and there are old, kind of very sick cats. And then there are even little cats inside mother cats that look at an early stage nothing like a cat at all. All of these are part of the same process. Very hard to think of them as the same thing in the way that I described things. They're certainly not much like medium-sized dry goods. And finally, the slightly less familiar, though increasingly so, is the absolute universality of symbiosis. Symbiosis is everywhere. Organisms are massively interdependent. So if you remember, I said that things are traditionally thought of as independent, autonomous. Nothing could be less true of anything in biology. And I want to say, and perhaps is something that I haven't explicitly said clearly enough, the problem for process philosophy is to understand the stabilization of these eddies. And when we look at living things, the stabilization comes, in a sense, in two directions. Stabilization, of course, comes from all these metabolic processes inside us, all the little tiny chemical interactions and little structures that form and degrade inside us. But they also come from outside, from our cooperative relations with many other organisms. And both of these are equally essential for the stabilization of an organism. So I'll just say a little bit more about these. I think I probably don't need to say much more about the first, except I guess just looking at it in another direction for those of you who are more familiar with physics. Another standard way of defining a living system is as a thermodynamically open system. We are systems far from equilibrium. We maintain ourselves, therefore, by constantly creating entropy outside ourselves. This is just a sort of physicist's way of saying the first point I made about the flow through us. And again, life cycles, I think, are fairly familiar. I mean, some of them are extremely exotic. This jellyfish-like thing on the bottom is a particularly wonderful one. Then I guess we're all much more familiar with the frog on the right and a typical insect. And these are very different structures that occur at different points in the life cycle. And when we think of the persistence of any of those things, we're clearly not thinking about the stability of properties. What we're thinking about is some kind of causal connection between the stages. But that is very far from the idea of things that persist as long as they maintain some set of properties. There's really very few properties in common between, the Medusa zygote and the polyp on these things. These are very, very different things. These, I think, are pretty obvious points. I just want to say a little bit more than that about symbiosis. Again, I guess this has sort of become very well known, but the extent of symbiosis is extraordinary. I guess we've all probably heard now of all the trillions of microbes that live in the human body, and the fact that they are actually not just, kind of passers-by that found a convenient, warm place to live. Many of them are essential for our health and well-being, and we would do very poorly without a great many microbes living with us. There are, I put up this story about insects, little slide there, because there are particularly wonderful relations between certain sets of microbes and insects that do amazing things like control their sex and what sex they are, and various very biologically important things for the insects. And this is actually a case where the two often are completely inseparable in the sense that they cannot live without one another. And then I guess one that's I like just because of its universal importance is the way plant roots depend on their intrinsic relations to countless fungi and bacteria in the soil. And in particular, there's the fungi that actually live inside the plant roots, and then they send their little mycelia, these little white threads usually, that go outside into the soil and interact with bacteria, and all of these essentially parts of the functioning of plants. This is something I'm in danger of digressing on at some length, because I recently got very interested in soil as a process. One of the things that's probably most likely to kill us all is the fact that people don't understand that soil is a process. In fact, a lot of experts say if we carry on using soil the way we do, basically as a pile of stuff that holds the plants upright, and we can keep tipping fertilizers in and the plants keep growing, we've got about 60 more harvests, and then we starve. So this is a fairly important point to understand, that soil in particular is something that is sustained by activity, by very complex activities of countless things that live interdependent lives inside it. I think maybe I will talk very briefly about one of my favorite examples, because it's so complicated that and that maybe isn't a very good reason for talking about it. But these are some of the most successful insects in the world. There are many species of these, but I'm not sure what that is. but leaf cutter ants, which essentially, so here's at the top, those are the ants. Here's a little diagram of their colonies. They're about 9 meters across, about 3 meters deep. Awful lot of ants in there. Many different kinds of ants doing different things. There's a division of labor, which I'll come back to, but there's a queen, there's soldiers, foragers. There's all kinds of ants that do different things inside the colony. And then one of the more wonderful things about this is the symbiotic fungi that essentially constitute the stomach of this colony. So the little white things in the picture are actually fungal colonies that the ants bring in the leaves, they feed them to the fungi, in collaboration actually with a lot of bacteria, produce the food that the ants eat. And there's all kinds of requirements on keeping this going. They have the waste dumps that need to be properly functioning, or the whole colony gets sick. And actually there are all kinds of microbes in there that are essential, for example, for keeping the wrong kind of fungi from invading, which is what usually kills the colonies in the end. There are the kind of those little bacteria that I was talking about that live inside the ants. There's probably the most widespread of all, and the symbiotic significance of these is very little understood. Viruses, we think of them still as basically just nasty things that we want to kill, and some of them are nasty, but almost certainly many of them are absolutely essential to life processes. Essentially, the flow of DNA around the system is quite largely mediated by viruses. Now, my point about this picture is, where are the organisms? Now, the whole system is certainly a functional whole, the whole colony. An ant is a pretty functional whole. If one takes the whole colony, for a long time, many biologists have wanted to call the colony a superorganism because of just the intimate interdependencies among the ants themselves. Is the fungus part of it? The fungus is obligatorily, that's the only place many of these fungi live. When the queen sets out with the new colony, she takes a bit of fungus with her to set up the next colony. So it's part of the reproductive continuity of the species. So what I want to say is there's no simple answer to where these organisms are. We have all these interdependent processes sustaining one another and doing it remarkably successfully. And I guess, just to sort of generalize a bit, as I described things don't really intertwine and have indeterminate boundaries. But this is just what processes are like. And I mean, very simply, like this nice picture of this tree. How many branches are there? Where does one branch end and the other begin? Or to go back to the kind of very classic example of river, how many rivers are there? I could look at a different picture of river and said, which is the river and which is the tributary? Why is, those of you know American geography, why is the Missouri a tributary of the Mississippi? It's a lot longer than the upper part of the Mississippi, but we happen to have chosen to call it the tributary. But there's there's nothing about this that says which bits of this process, when the river widens and becomes a lake, how wide does it have to be a lake? These aren't sort of questions that have simple answers. They're just ways we divide up the process in our minds to think about it. Okay, so here is my sort of picture of how we should think about life. All of these are these levels of organization, as they've sometimes been called, are stabilities in the flow of process. They are stabilized both from above and from below. So, simple example, take the heart in the middle. Of course, all kinds of processes, chemical processes go on in the heart to maintain it, its functionality. But as we all know, we have to do things as an organism to keep our hearts healthy. We have to exercise. And of course, we have to do that in part because of something more basic. The body, the rest of the body has to pump blood through it. The lungs have to oxygenate the blood and so on. So if you take the heart out of the whole organism, it will very soon be dead, just as if you disrupt what's going on inside the heart. And I think the same story could be told all up and down this hierarchy. So I think life is a hierarchy of processes, and causation happens both down and up this hierarchy. Thank you. Let me say something which I hope will sort of be obvious now, but one or two things that may be less obvious. Humans as processes. So when we think of a human, again, if we're asked to give a picture of a human, I'm afraid most people in the world probably come up with an adult male human. I know it might be some, of course, there are female humans too, and there are much younger stages. There are other stages in the life cycle. So again, there's no simple kind of thing that we should expect of a human. As I said, and again, just, repeating in this context, a point that I hope is obvious now, we're life cycles. Our properties change throughout life, and that's just the kind of being we are. And I guess, again, I've already referred to this, we are hugely symbiotic. I mean, essentially every boundary between us and the outside world is populated by very large numbers of microbes. And to greater or lesser degrees, these are functionally important to us. And of course, not every microbe that happens to be us all the time is good, or some of them are neutral, some of them are bad. Many of them are functional for us. I think, though, that actually just the point I want to make, which again is something terribly obvious, but that curiously doesn't fit terribly well in the world of things, is sociality. And sometimes we forget how massively social humans are. Actually, a sort of strange hero here for me, because in many ways he's taken up as a hero by people who I disagree with rather strongly, is Adam Smith. But of course, Adam Smith is one of the things he should be famous for is theorizing the division of labor. And one of the things that's extraordinary about humans is the massive extent to which particularly modern urban humans depend for their existence on countless hundreds or thousands of other people doing quite different things from what they do. So that what we do individually, I mean, there is no way that the life of a philosophy professor is self-sustaining. It creates no food, it makes no clothes, it builds no shelter. Only to the extent, I'm afraid, a declining extent to which people are interested in hearing the thoughts of philosophy professors will this particular little tiny piece in the puzzle of human existence continue. But all of us are in that same boat, even if some of us do things that are less dispensable than being philosophy professors. So that, incidentally, the picture below is of a pin factory of about the time of Adam Smith, because his famous example was of how efficient it was to have something like 15, I can't remember the number, different people doing sequential things in making pins. And I guess one person could make a pin, but the point was you can make an awful lot more pins if you divide up the labor. I can't help just remarking in passing that Adam Smith was completely aware of how awful it was spending your life doing one of these little jobs in a pin factory, and was very concerned about the potential bad effects of this efficient division of labor. But, that would be very much of a sidetrack, and I will stop myself. But but that we are not just social in the sense that we like to hang out together at parties, but that we are social in the sense that we are totally interdependent is, I think, something that just seems obvious when you think in terms of processes, but sometimes not nearly obvious enough, perhaps partly because we think too much in terms of autonomous things. One other point, I'll come back to that. Another crucial point, which has sort of become very visible in a lot of contemporary evolutionary biology, is the importance of the two-way interaction between organisms and their environment. And a kind of paradigm is these beavers building their dams, which are the environment that they're adapted to live in, but they're only a very visible example. This is true of countless cases. If there are Darwin aficionados, I guess one of my favorite examples is his book on earthworms and his wonderful account of how earthworms actually are essentially aquatic animals that affect the soil in ways that keep it moist enough for them to live there, despite the fact that they've stopped living in the water. But that's, again, my point here mainly is humans, of course, construct their environments. And particularly they construct their developmental environments. So I a little picture of a school here, just to remind us that becoming a competent adult human requires a great deal of input from other humans, just as also we maintain our health to the extent that we do with a great deal of help from many other humans. So I want to just say in summary about this, humans are highly symbiotic, highly social organisms, and they survive by virtue of very complex collaborations, not only, of course, with bacteria in their guts and on their skin and so on, but with lots of other humans. And one of the things they do is combine to construct environments that enable them to live and thrive. And I guess, just a little side point pointing down another track that I think is of very great interest to me. I think that the dominant political and social thinking of the last 150, I don't know, long time, under the title of individualism, maybe market individualism is the most dominant current version, is in a sense, I want to say, philosophically profoundly misguided, because it is based on the view of independent, autonomous humans and the notion of, kind of all competing with one another somehow, when, of course, we can compete with one another in little ways, but that's, in a way, so superficial compared to the ways that we necessarily and inevitably cooperate with one another. And I think that perhaps, if that could be the only outcome of making people think more processually, it might be the one I would choose. Probably doesn't have to be liberal. Liberal, of course, is a very, very vague word. I'm thinking of many different kinds of individualism, and certainly I don't want to hang any particular interpretation on liberal there. Okay, thank you. Okay, so I guess whatever kind of individual you're talking about an abstraction from what is actually a profoundly integrated flow of human and other life. Okay, so just finally, I want to just mention a couple of other things that I think are implications of some interest. And of course, I mean, this is in a sense, I'm afraid, much too brief, because this is in the end, where the project, lives or dies. This comes back to my, remarks at the beginning about the skepticism some of my colleagues have about doing, what I call metaphysics. Does it make a difference? I think it does make a lot of difference, but I just give a couple of final examples. One, more scientific, one more traditionally philosophical. So I want to think about medicine. And I think, one of the things I haven't talked about at all, but is very much tied up with the view of the world as things, is the view of organisms as machines, as essentially made up of parts, which were different kinds of things, kind of hooked together in certain ways so that the whole machine works. And if that's your view, then you tend to think in terms of your thought about medicine tends to be, you find the broken bit and you fix it, or maybe you replace it, or but essentially you're looking for the bit that went wrong, and you're trying to figure out how to fix it. I think from a process perspective, at least, the starting point is a little different. Because after all, the first thing to understand is the processes that stabilize human life cycles in the first place. And of course, then one can look at interventions that maintain and fortify, or when they're not working, restore these stabilizing processes. Now, I'm of course not saying, I think that this is I'm not saying that everything that people do in medicine is wrong and they need to change that they're doing it. I think a lot of what happens, certainly in social medicine, for example, a great deal, this is clearly what mostly is being done, and a great many medical procedures fit into this picture. But I think there's also things that perhaps we would think about better if we more explicitly took this processual view. And I want to just briefly talk about one example. It's the case of cancer. Now, cancer is a process. I mean, it's not something that just happens. And I think the first thing to think about is to think about the extraordinary process that goes wrong in the many, many ways we talk about as cancer. And in particular, what I have in mind is if one thinks about the human life cycle, one perspective on it is as trillions of cell divisions, cell differentiations, and cell deaths. I mean, that's what the life cycle, the kind of, the nuts and bolts of the life cycle is essentially cell division, differentiation, and death. Of course, I don't want to say that's all there is to life, but that's one way that it can be looked at. Now, this is, obviously, this is an extraordinary achievement. To stabilize this process so that cells divide at the right time, they differentiate, so, the cells in our kidney are not liver cells or brain cells, and so we get the right cells in the right places. And cells, of course, are constantly dying. This is part of the process that I was talking about. The metabolic flow is the division and death of cells. This, I say, you could hardly exaggerate what an amazing achievement the stabilization of this is. And many of the ways that this fails are among the many things that we call cancer, i.e. failure of cell death, failure of proper differentiation at the right time, and division happening to excess and not within the right parameters. And whatever these regulatory processes are, and of course some of this is understood, though not nearly all of it, but it's hardly surprising, particularly in view of, if you recall my picture of the hierarchy, things are stabilized from above and below. And this process is certainly one that is stabilized from above and from below. And things can go wrong, therefore, at many different levels of organization that can disrupt this process. And so I think one way of putting it is that we should think perhaps a little bit less about why we do get cancer and look at the, in a sense, really harder question: how is it that so often we don't get cancer? How is it that some of us survive for decades
Yeah, it's me here. So, yeah, thank you for this really very interesting talk. And I wanted to ask about the individuation of processes. How do you differentiate between different processes? Why do you say that you have here one process and not two processes? And for instance, if we take the problem of human identity, so The question is why, if humans are dependent on each other, and there are in some ways processes between them all the time. So why saying that there are several humans and not one human? How do you make this differentiation?
So the general answer to my general answer to that question is that it's really pragmatic. There isn't, nature does not tell us how many processes there are. This, I think, is one of the main ways that I want to push this, is that and one of the fundamental differences between this and the alternative view, that really separating the world out into distinct individual beings is something we do for pragmatic reasons. Now, having said that, I want to say, that some boundaries are much sharper than others. And when we look at large mammals like ourselves, we are, very strikingly distinct from our environments and other mammals, other organisms. Now, obviously, one of the things I'm trying to do is argue that it's not quite as distinct as it looks. But it's hard to imagine that pragmatically we wouldn't, for many purposes, distinguish individual humans. But on the other hand, I think it's also important that we might want to be much more willing to recognize higher kind of groupings of humans as having some comparable level of individuality. There may be good reasons to individuate families or various kinds of social groups. And I think that there's a certain kind of cultural or historical relativity to that. I mean, the extent to which we think of ourselves as individuals, particularly now that in ideologies of competitive individualism, is much stronger than it would have been in certain other kind of social forms. But I'm not suggesting, I don't believe there is any likelihood that we wouldn't, for many purposes, draw an individual boundary around the human organism. But I say just as much less, it is still ultimately a somewhat pragmatic decision. There's a question in the front and a question the second row. And then I'd say there was a question right in the back that I saw right at the first one. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much for your talk. The way you presented it, the world of ethics and politics and what we might call the normative was like the other side of it, right? It had those effects. So, and it's kind of, you need for your ethics to individuate in all kinds of ways. But you also pointed out the problem of it could be, it should actually go in the other direction. So the question I have is, there are systems of ethics that seem more organistic. And when they are presented, they're never presented, except for in the case of Whitehead, as the back of his philosophy. They're never presented together with the metaphysic of the type that you're presenting. But they are out there, communitarianism and such, right? Do you believe that presenting these systems, these normative systems, these ethical systems, with your scholarship, with your way of thinking, your what we would call metaphysics, will support them, is necessary, is in any way going to save them or advance them? Or, as many people point out, they can live without it. They can live without the metaphysics, just like the other side lives without their metaphysics.
That's a very difficult question. I suppose I probably think they can live without it, but I also think that in the end, I think there's a point in debates between different ethical perspectives where you do come down to a conception of human nature, and obviously that's what I'm hoping to make an observation about. And I think you certainly reduce the plausibility of some ethical ways of thinking and support the plausibility of others. I'm reluctant to say that this is a decisive kind of argument for one ethical way of thinking rather than another, partly because I don't spend much of my life thinking about ethical systems. And, so this is partly just a question of my own willingness to move into an area where people spend their lives thinking about this and say, can't think like that because I've, coming from, but of course that, that's not a decisive point. So I think there's clearly, I do believe there's a great deal of relevance, possibly in the privacy of my own, study. I might think that certain ways of thinking about ethics really weren't sustainable, given what I think to be the proper way of thinking about human existence. But I'm a little reluctant to say that very firmly. Arnon, there's a question in the front after.
In physics, Planck constant is a unit of action, which relates very well with your idea. The problem is there is no feedback mechanism, so we end up with dark energy and dark matter.
So now what mechanisms? I'm sorry?
Feedback mechanism.
Okay, right.
How do you relate the Planck's constant in biology as a unit?
I'm afraid I'm just really going to have to pass on that question because I'm not sufficiently expert in the physics. I think I said at the beginning, I strongly incline to think that this is a story that goes all the way down. I've thought quite a little bit about and had collaborators who thought about chemistry, mostly large molecules. But when it comes to the question whether this is a kind of story that works at the more fundamental physical level, I just have to say, well, I'm glad some people I talk to say that they really sympathize with it, and probably others would sympathize less. But I just have to plead incompetence to answer that question, I'm afraid.
Just wonder, what do you think about what is going on at the moment in biology, especially evolutionary biology, but not only? Do you think that it is taking more of a kind of process approach? Because, for example, there is a lot more emphasis today on understanding plasticity, on a very much more dynamic notion of heredity and so on, and other things. So what do you think that there is a kind of change, or do you think that there is a kind of spiral going back to ideas that were current in the early 20s?
Yes, to both. I mean, very much so. I mean, I think that one of the problems is that scientists are even more reluctant than philosophers of science on the whole to think too much about what seem like very abstract metaphysical questions. But if the question is, do I interpret contemporary evolutionary biology as moving? Very much so. I mean, I think a lot of my inspiration to think this way actually probably comes from thinking about evolutionary biology, because on the one hand, just as you say, I mean, the growing, the importance of plasticity, yeah, I mean, and of course, there's a lot of inspiration. I didn't touch on this, but as you rightly say, there was a number of the most influential theoretical biologists in the earlier 20th century were quite explicitly, in fact, enthusiasts for Whitehead, and often a much more accessible source for this thing. And of course, on the other side, I'm inclined to think that the sort of maybe I should say the Dawkins vision of evolutionary biology is the most wonderful paradigm of thinking in evolution. Essentially, evolution is just constant sequences of the same things, just changing their frequencies, and all the process just abstracted away. And of course, I mean, your own work on epigenetics is another thing that I could very well mention in this context. But absolutely, I mean, I certainly interpret very much as something that's moving very much on many fronts in a more processual way. Question right in front of you.
Thanks for most inspiring and understandable talk. I have a general question and a specific one. The general question is, what do you think is going to happen as a result of the digital revolution to the behavior of man? You don't need to answer it in the limited time we have available. I'd be glad to get it in little bits, in a process, a long-range process. The specific question, would you like to respond to this first?
Well, I mean, look, I think, as you rightly intimated, the question is what I think the digital revolution, the effect on the evolution of the organization, the behavior. I think that my main answer to that question is to say I really mostly I don't know, and then I don't what I think I know. I don't have time. But let me just mention one thing. I'll just give because one thing I do very strongly believe is that human behavior changes quite quickly. I mean, it's one of the, I spent a long time arguing with, kind of evolutionarily minded, evolutionary psychologists, people who think we don't really change much at all because we're still more or less living in the Stone Age. One little case that I was very struck by was, and this is, I suppose, I guess this is a pretty universal experience for people of my sort of generation, was a period of astonishment as the spread of mobile phones and the difference in behavior that this created. And, obviously, first of all, just sort of astonishment at all these people sitting around in trains 6 feet away from me having this. But it occurred to me then that one of the really profound things that's happening there is that social organization is changing and becoming something, and that always up to this point has essentially been spatial, that communication was mostly with a group of people who you were spatially close to. And now, increasingly, people have groups of friends that need no spatial contact at all. I mean, this is just sort of observation of my children, for example. I see they have these friends, and they're talking to them all the time, all of them, even though they're scattered across the world. Now, that's a pretty profound thing. I think it's a slightly disturbing one in some ways, but we're very plastic, if I can use the word again. I'm sure we will accommodate to this. But I guess the drift of the argument is that I think the effects will be profound. I have very little claim to expertise about what they will be, and I probably think that nobody knows. I mean, there are some very profoundly new things happening, and they will certainly change our behavior in more or less deep ways, I think.
Perhaps I give somebody else a chance to ask the question. If I may.
Let's see if there's time, we'll come back to you.
I'll ask the other question.
Thank you for an illustrious presentation. It was very interesting. Most of the examples of processes we understood them. I think I understood them. But then in your last slide, you posed the question: is a person an old person identical to the young person? Mm-hmm. And the implication was obviously not. But what about the DNA in that person? That's immutable, and so how would this explain or jive with the whole idea of immutable changes?
Okay, that's quite a large question. It's certainly one that I have thought about. I guess maybe one place, because I don't think the DNA is immutable. I referred briefly to rather an expert on the subject, to people with you, but epigenetics, one of the important things, I don't know if you're familiar with the fact that the genes we have are constantly being changed. We maintain the sequence, but chemical modification of the genes changes what they do. So there's a feature of the genes that remains the same, but it's not the feature that determines what they do. So it is by no means, I think, true that that the genes in the relevant functional sense maintain themselves throughout our lives. I'd also say, of course, which genes? I mean, there are various, because we are symbiotic. There are all kinds of genes in us, and some of them are changing much more rapidly than others. But perhaps that's a little bit of a cheap kind of point. But I mean, and of course, our genes even mutate in terms of sequence quite a bit during our lifetimes. So I guess one final point is, of course, our genes themselves, our genomes, let's say, are processes. They're processes that don't just maintain themselves by, being there. They maintain themselves by our actively maintaining them. But I guess the real point is, I mean, I'm not saying that we're not the same person, provided by person. You mean a certain kind of process, which is a process that happens very regularly all the time, from the fertilization of a human egg till death. These processes happen, and for many reasons we like to distinguish these processes and consider, and that's what we mean when we say a person is most, at least, of that process. So I'm not saying we shouldn't say that. I'm saying that philosophers who worry what exactly is it that makes us that should worry less, because we're not trying to say we are some kind of stable thing. We are something very mutable. Even at the level of genetics, we are mutable. And actually, if you look at these ideas in epigenetics, we're very mutable. And that's just one of the things that it persists throughout our life, changing more or less, depending what happens in our lives. So I don't think I think the main thing I would say is genes aren't as special as we tend to think. They're essential, but so are lots of things in us. But they're very, they're part of the whole process. They're a part of the process that we maintain. It's by doing biological work, and they change in significant ways throughout the lifetime. So I don't think that they really, I'd want to say anything fundamentally different about our DNA than other chemicals.
Thank you for a lovely talk, and thank you for coming. So I have sort of a nitpicky question for clarification. So I'm not sure what distinction you make between change and process, because some of the cases that you describe are generic cases of change. So just to give some of the things that one might think, suppose we think about the classic picture of an atom, and we have the electrons going around the nucleus. Well, you can call it a change, but maybe not a process. Suppose we have a simple pendulum with no friction, so it goes back and forth. There is change, but there is not a process. And on the other hand, someone like Dawkins might say that the change in frequencies is a change, so it's a process, the evolutionary process. Everybody's talking about process. So some clarification on that might be helpful for me at least.
Thanks, that's a very good question. I guess something I didn't touch on at all, and perhaps is one part of this project needs to be some kind of classification of processes. There are many different kinds of processes. I'm particularly interested in persistent processes, persistent patterns that exist, and that's what I tend to talk most about. To my professional friends, I talk about continuant processes, and that. Oh, I won't go to that. That can annoy people, actually. But at any rate, that's what. So when I say we're a process, that's a particular model I have in mind. But there are processes that don't have that kind of stability. Evolution is a process, but it doesn't have the same stability. I mean, evolution gives the state of the evolved world just goes from one state to another, not down any particular preordained path, and all the stages are different. And then there are processes that happen to persistent processes. So, if I get sick, that's a process that is happening to this continuum process, and it's obviously a different kind of process. It's not well, I hope it's not a persistent. If it's a persistent thing, it's a different kind of persistent thing. So absolutely, if I were to try and fill out this as a full kind of philosophical system, I would need to make a lot of distinctions between different kinds of processes, and I'll probably be perfectly happy to say that the movement of the I don't know what to say about them, because I mean it's not clear whether there are any electrons or whether they really are just. But if there were, or if there are, then their movements or their movements, the quantum leaps or whatever, a sort of process, I guess. But absolutely, no, that's something that needs a lot more elaboration, I think.
I think we spoke about this a bit yesterday, but I'll kind of ask it again. Can you say something about the special relation between process on the one hand and indeterminacy on the other, and how that would differ from a kind of billiard ball understanding of reality? And is that to some degree part of the project, that process is more amenable to indeterminacy and therefore is to some degree more attractive to you?
It's an interesting. I'm not sure how necessary the connection is, but there are a couple of things that I want to say. One is just autobiographically, there's definitely a connection. I was unhappy with a kind of billiard ball determinism long before I really started thinking about process philosophy. I probably bore everybody if I went into much detail about that, but that's certainly a fact about my intellectual biography. I also, the way I think about processes is certainly as more or less open-ended. And this comes from, I guess, thinking about a lot of issues in biology where I think that, that there's nothing about our understanding that should lead us to think of this as deterministic, as having a predetermined end. But how necessary that is, whether one could be a process determinist, I think one could probably. It would be, I think, a very odd position, because I think determinism to me is a very odd position. and I think, and I actually think determinism is a peculiar view that really does derive from billiard balls. I mean, there's a wonderful quote, which I can't get quite right, by the British philosopher Elizabeth Anscombe, where she says there's, in one sense, the early scientific research on the solar system was an intellectual disaster, because this was an example of a system that was essentially sufficiently closed to exhibit almost deterministic behavior, and became a sort of model for the clockwork universe. Of course, these are rather big billiard balls, but it's along the same lines. But I think that it's kind of the I mean, of course, it goes back much further, but one of the reasons that the scientific revolution was the kind of pinnacle, perhaps, of this thinking was also pinnacle of deterministic thinking, because we got these amazing laws that seemed like the whole truth about something. And if you tie that to billiard balls, which were just the kinds of things those laws were supposed to be about, you've got this weird view of a deterministic universe, and contrary, I guess, to all our experience of everything. I mean, nothing seems to be deterministic. It's just a strange philosophical thought that has gripped the minds of many philosophers, I think. So I mean, I guess that's really my deepest response to that is the question is why are the people who believe in determinism? And I don't know a story in a kind of process view of the world. I mean, maybe I'll just say one other thing, which is again has to be historical, because I can't really justify what I'm saying. But my earlier work that Arnon referred to, a book called The Disorder of Things. I mean, really, one of the main themes of that was that the kind of orderly clockwork regularity that people sometimes associated with the scientific worldview was an extraordinarily local and rare phenomenon, that actually disorder was the normal ground state of things. And it's just by virtue particularly of making machines and devoting extraordinary ingenuity to making them reliable, i.e. by trying to essentially figure out all the things that could possibly intervene with them, and actually defending them against these. I mean, this is how we get these cars that run for tens of thousands of miles is not because it's a deterministic universe and cars just run and run. It's because people have devoted billions of hours of ingenious labor to preventing all the things that would normally happen to make the thing turn rapidly indeterministic. So, as I say, I think in general, I mean, I guess the reason I struggle to know exactly how to answer the question is I have no sympathy at all with the deterministic worldview. So I'm not quite sure where I want to disagree with it most.
I'm just wondering if you could briefly talk about perhaps the idea of what kind of properties processes have as opposed to things, because processes obviously have to be temporally extended. They can't just exist at some instant. And so as a result, are you thinking of properties as being different than the way a thing person would think of properties, as functional properties, dispositional properties, things like that?
That's a large question. I mean, I guess the simple answer, though it's only, I'm sure, part of the answer, is implicit in the way you put your question. I mean, certainly many properties of processes cannot exist instantaneously. And you know, this again is another aspect I haven't really dwelt on much in this talk, is though I think implicitly, I hope I have, is the necessity of temporal extension. I mean, a process, by virtue of what I gave as my definition of change, that of process, that a process cannot continue to exist without changing. Therefore, clearly, it has to exist for more than an instant, because it has to have different properties at different times. I suppose that doesn't actually, I suppose it's still possible that the properties could be, all the properties could be potentially instantaneous. And so I suppose I'm not sure what I want to say that beyond what I gave, what I've tried to give as a general definition, that I mean, the general story that things must have a certain number of properties that persist while the thing exists, and by default, their properties do stay the same. I mean, their change is something that requires explanation. Processes, by at least as I would define them, have to have changing properties. But whether they are there by different kinds of properties, or whether the properties of a process are necessarily properties that themselves must persist through time, I'm not sure I have an answer to that.
There we go. Thank you. So my question is, you talked about personal identity, and you suggested a kind of a deflationary view that says that, well, there might be various pragmatic reasons for defining a person in one way or another. And I was thinking about whether you have a similarly deflationary view when it comes to defining life processes, or the processes that we associate with organisms. That is, maybe you can say more about the view that says that the view that why there are no things, but everything is fundamentally a process. Distinguish that from the view that why there are no living things, but all life is a process. Is there a clear-cut distinction between the first view and the second, or is it also kind of pragmatic, whether we think of certain processes as associated with organisms or with life, and others as not?
So I understand the question. So is the question whether I'm taking a deflationary view of life by saying life, like everything else, is just a process? Is that
right? I mean, are you, if you're flimsy about persons, how can you be less flimsy about life?
I don't think I'm flimsy about I just think that persons do not have the kind of persistence that many philosophers worry about. I.e., they try and explain the persistence where I would say there really isn't anything to explain. I mean, it's all as it seems to be. But I don't think there's anything deflation. I mean, so it's a deflationary view of a kind of philosophical problem, particular philosophical problem, that I think is grounded in the wrong metaphysical view of what a person is. But I don't think it's deflationary about life. I mean, that's just what life is like, in my view. It's all change all the time. Well, I mean, of course, that's it. There's no life without change, but of course, there is also the persistence that there is. I mean, we stay the same shape pretty much from one day to the other, though not necessarily from one decade to the other. I mean, everything is about different time scales of persistence. This is, again, I didn't really go into that, though it might have been implicit in that hierarchical diagram. I mean, one aspect of that hierarchy is the things at the bottom tend to be much more transient than the things at the top. And there's an aspect of this picture which is very important, that treating something as a thing is actually fine. And of course, one of the philosophical burdens of this argument is to give some story as to why, most of the time the thing view of the world has seemed to work pretty well for people. And the answer to that is the thing view works as long as you are treating as something as a thing over a suitable time period. So you can even have a mechanistic view of biology, provided that the mechanisms you describe have parts that are well stabilized over the period of the kind of activity that you're trying to explain with your mechanism. What you have to remember is that they're only stable for, sometimes very short periods of time, and sometimes, these can be very short, and they can still be long enough to tell a story that looks like a sort of mechanistic story about how they interact to do something. So there's no part of life that I want to be deflationary about. It's just I want to say, we, in some fundamental way, are somewhat inclined to misdescribe it. We describe it in terms of stable parts, stable entities, and there aren't any. And the way we think about, particularly about things that persist over time, tends to be as if that's not a problem. I mean, there's nothing to explain here, right? Because just nothing's happened to it. But of course, if nothing happens to it, it's dead. I know that's. I'm
sorry, that was the final phrase. I'm sorry to turn down. This is unfortunate enough, right?